Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us at the Legal HR Summit. The Legal HR Summit is a two-day online event hosted by Ius Laboris, the largest employment law alliance in the world. This session is a part of the Asia bloc and will be followed by other curated sessions of the region. I am now turning over to Desmond Wee to begin the session. Desmond, you're welcome to start.
Thanks a lot, Isadora. A very good afternoon to everyone who has joined us, and welcome to the Asia sessions of the Legal HR Summit. Now, looking back at the 9 months since the COVID-19 pandemic first hit us in Asia, and it's clear to many of us that we did not appreciate how much the virus would have upended the world and the social life as we knew it. Now, you think back to 9 months ago, you were just sitting there and you remember some of the pronouncements that came out like, oh, it's just the flu. Like SARS, it will die out in the hotter months. We'll all be done by August. Now, looking back, and that certainly sounded like wishful thinking, didn't it? Well, many countries in Asia took action early. Well, some earlier and some later, and the closing of offices and telecommuting, working from home, alternative work arrangements, however you would want to term it, was one of the most significant actions taken in recent memory to curb the virus. Some companies certainly did so in accordance with their HQ directives. Some of us were actually required by law to do it. Companies in different countries also had different arrangements. Now, as the pandemic spread at a different pace in different countries, in different continents, the expectations of telecommuting or working from home in different countries also evolved. What started out as full work from home arrangements for many companies have evolved and are continuing to evolve into very different variants, very much like the virus itself, if there's any irony in that. So here we are 9 months on, and I would say that we are certainly at the crossroads of how we see the future office is to be and the way we will be working, the way we'll be working in the future. And if you've read all the newspaper articles, the larger companies, the multinationals, the tech companies, Microsoft, Facebook, Google, in the early days, even as the pandemic was spreading, they had already said that working from home will be a permanent arrangement, will be something that a lot of their employees would be able to take advantage of. But if you notice in the more recent days, as we get a better grip of how the pandemic is spreading in the various countries, you have seen a refresh in this sort of thinking. Companies now look at hybrid arrangements. Companies look at different alternatives. And certainly in Asia, in recent surveys, the way that many companies have been working, it is not a situation where most companies feel that they can do a full pivot to home. In an example of a survey in South Korea, only 46% of South Korean companies have said that they were willing to let their employees work from home. So that's very interesting. However, of course, if you look at it from the employee's perspective, an earlier survey in May, that was right when we were starting or moving into the first few months of the pandemic in May, 80% of all employees who were surveyed said that they were very happy working from home. I'm sure that there were many reasons for them to do so. And 46% of them said that they were just as productive. A recent survey would have caused that number, the 80%, to go down much more. And so there is what we hear very commonly, fatigue. Fatigue from working from home, fatigue of having to deal with a different environment, fatigue to have to deal with different challenges. So for companies who are asking the question, where is the future office going to be? In the next 30 minutes, we're hoping to be able to share with you some of the views of our panelists and weave in the regulations and the legal issues into that discussion, and hopefully to give you a better understanding of the challenges that you'll face. Now, my panelists today, a very esteemed panel, comprise partners from member firms of our Ius Laboris network. And whilst I will not address specifically each of the years of experience, in aggregate, we bring together 80 years of bench experience to this discussion. So it is certainly something that their sharing and their views it's going to be interesting. It's going to be very relevant. Firstly, we have Catherine Weaver, who's the managing partner of Lewis Silkin, Hong Kong office. Catherine's going to give a wave. Secondly, we have Heidi Fairhall from Course Chambers with us in Australia. Heidi is moving into the later part of the day, so after this, she'll be starting her cocktail hour. Thirdly, we have Gagan Verma from Kocher and Company in India. Fourthly, we have Cesar Santamaria Jr. from C&G Law, who's in the Philippines, whom we will call June, and you'll hear me referring to him as June, so please don't be confused, June. And finally, my name is Desmond Wee. I'm a partner in Raja & Tan, Singapore, and I will be your moderator for this session. So, a great place to start our conversation is with a poll, and we will continue to have various poll questions as we go along so that we can actually have a better and clearer connection of what are the issues that you think about and for us to be able to address those kind of things. Before we put up the poll question, I do want to give a caveat. I cannot promise you that it will have the same, this poll is going to have the same excitement of what's happening in the US. But the one thing I can promise you, at least, I will give you the very clear answer almost immediately without having to wait. I promise you that, right? So let's start with the first question, poll question 1. And we're gonna put it up on screen. You're gonna have 10 seconds. And this is something that is very interesting, and we wanted to get a sense of what is your organization's current arrangements for your workforce. Just click on one, and we're gonna put it up for a few more seconds. And after that, I will get Isadora to put up the responses. I did promise you an immediate response. Let's give it another 3-4 seconds. And we're good. Now let me get Isadora to put up the responses. Very interesting. Now, if you look at the first answer, all employees are required to return to work in the office. That comes in as the slowest. And certainly you will see already from this poll of the audience that there are variations and there are different hybrid models. And that is quite consistent, and numerous surveys done in different continents have certainly showed that the majority of employees favored some kind of staggered work week. And a lot of them would never want to go back to the pre-COVID-19 arrangement. So Catherine, if I may start with you, what do you make of these responses in this poll question? And is it consistent with what you've seen with employers in Hong Kong? Catherine?
I think Hong Kong's a bit of the outlier here on this, in that we're probably at the later stage of coronavirus hitting our jurisdiction. So we're on wave 3, and we're at the tail end of that wave. And in total, since the end of January through to now, we've had 5,349 cases and 106 deaths in total. So obviously not great numbers, but not awful when compared to some of the other world statistics. So given that we are near the end of the 3rd wave of coronavirus, and given that Hong Kong has never mandated any lockdown or work from home rules, then it's always been at the employer's discretion as to whether employees work from home or work in the office. And whilst there were a lot of work from home arrangements, and what generally happened was the private sector followed the public sector. So if the government ordered the civil service to work from home, then the private sector generally followed. And then when they were ordered back, then the private sector then said to people, you should be coming back. And that's how it's gone on and off 3 times now. But the general trend right now is that most people are back in the office. There are larger companies that are still doing a bit of rotation, sort of 50% or 75% team A, team B going on, but most people are now back in the office. And I think that's down to a few things. I think it's to do with Hong Kong culture as well, which has traditionally been long hours working in the office for various reasons, societal reasons, such as presenteeism being quite prevalent here, Hong Kong homes being quite small generally, and the commute not being particularly long. So Hong Kong's probably more susceptible to having people return to the office earlier than in other countries. And also, Hong Kong people are just naturally pretty cautious. So whilst we are returning to the office, we are doing it in a very cautious way. Everyone's wearing masks. There's lots of social distancing. So yes, people are back in the office in general, but there is a feeling, and the stats here, there has been a survey here looking at what people would like to do. And this is interesting because, as I say, traditionally Hong Kong has been quite a work in the office, work all hours culture. But the stats that were done, 66% of those surveyed in Hong Kong said that they would like in the future, once coronavirus is over, to work once or twice from home. And only 18% of those surveyed said that they would not ever want to work from home again. So it looks as though employees' attitudes in Hong Kong are changing, but it'd be interesting to know if employers' attitudes are also changing.
Thanks a lot, Catherine. You mentioned that from a Hong Kong perspective, there wasn't really any legal requirements in relation to working from home arrangements, and that's certainly a contrast from Singapore. There was also some guidelines issued by the government to the private sector in terms of these sort of arrangements. What is the kind of legal effect of those guidelines if for whatever reason companies make that decision? No, I'm just going to make sure everybody's going to come back to the office.
Yeah, sure. So the guideline from the government was to allow staff to work from home as far as possible to reduce the flow of people and social contact in the community. But it was a guideline, and Hong Kong employers saw it as such and treated it as such. So given that there was no government mandate to work from home and no lockdown, when employers wanted employees to return to the office, they simply stated that people had to return to the office, and people did return to the office. That's generally what happened. But I think your question was what would happen if employees refused to do that. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Well, in that situation, given that it was very much a temporary measure for people to work at home, nobody was issued with, in the majority of cases, there was no formal variation of people's contracts put in place as a result of this. It was made very clear that it was temporary. Then, as such, employers had the right contractually to ask people to return from home. That said, if employees did state they had a genuine reason for why they couldn't return to the office due to genuine concerns around health, so if they're a high-risk person or they live with a high-risk person or their commute involves various modes of transport that takes them into high-risk areas, then it would be best practice for an employer to consider those reasons and whether it's appropriate to order that person to come back to the office. And not just best practice, under the Occupational Safety and Health Ordinance in Hong Kong, there is an obligation to take reasonable steps to look after and create a safe environment for employees. So considering that duty of care, an employer must weigh that up as to whether it's appropriate then to order that person to come back to the office.
Thanks, Catherine. So certainly it seems like there are various different laws in Hong Kong that will actually be woven together in relation to dealing with these sort of situations, but not necessarily there is no specific law that has been passed by the Hong Kong government in relation to dealing with specifically the COVID-19 situation.
Well, just to say on that, there have been lots of laws brought in around social distancing, but they've been focused on the public areas and restaurants and cinemas, etc. Those rules have specifically excluded workplaces generally. So there has been laws that have been brought in. There's still rules in place right now, even though we have very low numbers. We've only had 11 new cases this week, 11 new internal cases, not imported ones. But we still can only go out in groups of 6, and we still are mandated to wear masks at all times. But as I say, there's always been an exception for workplaces within those rules.
Right. Hong Kong has 6, Singapore is 5. We always joke that you kind of know whether if you are part of your close friend network, depending on whether you're invited out or not. Gagan, if I can move over to you, and perhaps you can share with us in terms of the current trends that you see in India and your perspective of this situation.
So Desmond, in India, most of the MNCs are following and abiding by the guidelines issued by the Government of India during lockdown in May 2020, wherein the private sector was allowed to operate with 1/3 of its strength. So it is a wait and watch situation for India, being a large demography with north, south, west, east. The seasons change, demographies change, languages and cultures change. Like in Mumbai is being continuously hit by floods, and then again repeated change in waves of coronavirus. Delhi is now also facing the same. So the corporates are very cautious in implementing return to work though they really want to. I could see that now because our economy is also taking a hit. So preference for the corporates is for employees to come back. Maybe after COVID, the coronavirus vaccine comes into place. The scenario might change. But this time, I think what we are looking at currently, it is one third of the strength, which is being the general practice being followed by the large corporates.
Thanks,
Desmond.
Gagan. I also understand that there in terms of different industries, there may be also some variance to this one third limitation. I would certainly imagine that that's from an economic perspective where a lot of countries feel that they need to balance between public health and the need to restart the economy, or the need to make sure that the cure is not worse than the illness itself.
Of course, yes. Certain sectors like manufacturing sector, construction sector, uh, there are emergency services like hospitals and private hospital staffs and all. They are being permitted to work with full strength. But there are certain, standard of operation procedures which are being implemented, which they have to follow. Uh, Exception to this is, corporates. In the IT and IT-enabled services. There are certain, telecom guideline norms through which they are permitted to work only from their workplace under certain licenses. So the government has relaxed those norms until 31st of December, and they are permitted to use telecom equipments out of licenses through, working from their home. So that is till 31st of December 2020. So let's see whether it gets extended or not. Desmond.
Thanks, Gagan. Let me move back down to Southeast Asia. And June, perhaps if I can get you to share with the audience in terms of the views on how employers in Philippines have been addressing this issue of balancing between working from home and going into the office.
For the Philippines, it's generally some form of a work from home arrangement. It's adopted or encouraged unless the work is of the type that cannot be performed from the home. For example, frontliners in the service industries or line workers in manufacturing firms.
And thanks, June. And having heard from Catherine in terms of the Hong Kong government and the preference to actually be guided by guidelines and other practices, and we had Gagan talking about kind of limitations. What about in Philippines? Is it mandated by law in terms of these kind of arrangements, or is it really led by private sector and the companies on what they're doing in terms of these sort of work from home arrangements?
I think the current work from home arrangements are due to a combination of factors, law and practice. First of all, a reduced workforce presence is mandated by law in certain areas and industries in the Philippines. We have defined 4 levels of community quarantine, and we have categorized all our industries into 4 groups. And based on that, the level of allowable work size presence ranges from 0 to skeleton to 50% to 100%, depending on the quarantine level and the industry category. For example, in the nation's capital, Metro Manila, where a general community quarantine is imposed, entertainment industries are not allowed to operate at any level. Hotels, they're allowed to have a skeleton workforce. Construction projects, legal and accounting firms, recruitment and placement agencies for overseas employment are allowed to have 100% of their workforce on site. Then certain working age individuals are not allowed by law outside the home in the Philippines. Those with health risks, pregnant women, and those living with these persons are generally not allowed outside of the home. So these also contribute to the reduced presence of employees or to the increase in the work from home arrangements. Also, our Department of Labor has allowed certain work arrangement as a coping mechanism for the financial effects of the pandemic. So firms are allowed to reduce work hours and work days. They're allowed to put employees on forced leaves, and they are also allowed to put workers on a rotation basis. So all of these factors contribute to the reduction of the presence of workers in the work site.
Thanks a lot, June. Let me then swing over to Australia now, and perhaps Heidi, if I can get you to share some of your perspectives in this situation.
Thanks, Desmond. Australia is an interesting example because generally we operate from the employment perspective as a Commonwealth, and we have federal industrial laws that apply pretty much to everyone except sort of state government entities. But what COVID's really done is brought back the emphasis on state by state regulation and differences. So we had our federal government bring down a sort of 3-step plan back in May that generally the states sort of were all supposed to follow, which was a graduated step back into dealing and returning to work. But what we've seen since then is quite a divergence between the states, which is in part driven by outbreaks, and we've seen that in Victoria recently, which had quite a severe outbreak and required a lockdown, but also some variations in the state government health guidance and regulations. So that's causing headaches for a lot of employers who generally operate across Australia, not in any particular state. And some employers have had to sort of move away from a uniform requirement about whether people are going to be working from home or returning to work and move to a state-by-state tailored approach. So in New South Wales, we've got the Minister directing employers to allow employees to work at their place of residence if it's reasonably practical to allow them to do that. But that's more of a permissible thing, whereas in Victoria, it's stronger. So employers must not permit workers to perform work at the employer's workplace where it's reasonably practical for them to work from home. So sort of still the public guidance in those states is geared towards working from home. But in other states like Queensland, and Western Australia, they've closed their borders to some states and they've effectively got zero community transmission of COVID. And so they don't really have public health restrictions except on some businesses that are operating in the public sphere, like hairdressers and gyms. And businesses in those places are returning to BAU. But we've sort of got that real tension because there's the need to kickstart the economy and state governments are very conscious of that. So in New South Wales, for example, though we've got this regulation which must allow people to work from home if it's reasonably practical when they want to do so, we've also got the state government requiring public servants in New South Wales to sort of urging them to start returning to work to kickstart the central business district economy. So there's that tension there which we're seeing. And the other parties, a lot of employers, I think, are still coming to terms with what they need to do to provide a COVID-safe work environment, and many have not put that in place. And we've also seen a lot of large corporates openly coming out and saying that things will not return to the way they used to be. We are going to use this opportunity. We've seen how flexibility can work for us, and we are going to sell off our office blocks and move towards a more flexible workplace environment where people can work from home. But that invites a lot of legal challenges with that, and our sort of, I think, as we'll talk about this later in the seminar, but our employment regulations and laws aren't always geared to respond to that flexibility.
That's very interesting, Heidi. Just following on from the point that Catherine had responded to earlier in terms of the compliance and the ability of employers to be able to compel employees to adhere to their guidelines. I would imagine that in Australia, because of the tension between your federal laws and your state laws, that there could be a situation where if there's sort of issues coming up, what is the situation from the employer's perspective in terms of their ability to compel employees to adhere to their guidelines?
Well, in where there's public orders requiring working from home, obviously that's sort of out of the question. But in those other states where the public guidelines aren't there, or the public health orders aren't compelling people or employers to require working from home, we're really seeing a real tension, actually. So some employers are wanting employees to return to work and are getting towards the stage of issuing a direction to do so, but aren't quite there and are pretty tentative about it because of the tension between their work health and safety obligations, which are not dissimilar to the other jurisdictions we've been talking about. And that's sort of in part complicated by, we've received sort of guidance from the Australian Public Australian Health Protection Principal Committee, which is basically comprised of the state and territory chief health officers, that have said you really have to have special measures in place for vulnerable workers, and that means that includes conducting health assessments or particular risk assessments for them, but also considering alternative arrangements. So if the circumstances of the individual are such that they are vulnerable for whatever reason, if they're over a particular age or from a particular cultural background, in Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people 50 years and over have been classified, if they have a chronic medical condition, as a vulnerable worker. So if you've got a vulnerable worker, you really do have to be responsive to their circumstances, and you have to look at alternate work arrangements. So it's not as simple as issuing a direction, and it may not necessarily be lawful and reasonable and have to be complied with.
Thanks a lot, Heidi. Okay, so having heard from our various panelists in relation to what the current situation is, let's move on to more of the theme of what we're talking about in terms of where is the future office going to be. And certainly at this point in time, there is a question in terms of trying to put in place what we talk about the future office. I do want to put a caveat here in the sense that our conversation here today with our various panelists is to kind of give you a framework in terms of the parameters, the legal issues, the concerns that you need to deal with. We're certainly not in the position to say, okay, in terms of physical arrangements, in terms of how the office is going to look like. For that, this is a plug for our next session. At the 4 o'clock session, we're going to have more of our clients of the network who will be able to share what their current practices are and the kind of best practices that they would certainly recommend. So that's really just to give a better sense of in terms of how we're going to continue with this session. Okay, now if I can move on to the next, yes.
Sorry. I think we can make a few comments on that, though, not to do the HR side of things, but there are some legal implications of thinking about the future of work and the future office. So I don't know if you want to look at that now or at a later stage, but I think, given that there have been a number of people on the Q&A asking for us to do a little bit of crystal ball gazing, we could do so within a legal context, but I'll leave that to you as the moderator to decide whether to do now or a bit later on.
Absolutely, and I do see quite a few of our attendees actually asking it from that perspective. So let's just jump straight into that question in terms of how we see the future office is going to be from that perspective. And Catherine, if you can start me off in terms of this.
Sure. Well, interestingly, people have focused on real estate. Again, not really our area as employment lawyers, but I do think that we will have to be looking at square footage. I think now that the world has shown it can work from home, whereas it may not have believed it was entirely possible before, and certainly Hong Kong would have been very reluctant to consider that before. It is now possible. We've demonstrated it. So employers now, and certainly my clients, are thinking about what their future office will look like. And generally in Hong Kong, commercial leases are for 2-year periods and then renewable. But now is a time that a lot of employers are thinking, do we need that square footage? Do we need to be in the center of Hong Kong? Can we be saving money? How do we reconfigure? And if we do reconfigure, how do we do so safely? So again, thinking about our health and safety obligations, so bringing back the law here rather than just the HR aspects, but how do we do it safely? So if we're going to move to a more agile workplace, then we need to make sure it's done in a sanitized way. So we can have hot desks, but we have to make sure that there are rules for how we operate with hot desks. Yeah, I think we will be moving to that model. The legal implications of doing so will mean having to have more flexible contracts. The contracts are pretty rigid at the moment. They have a place of work, they've got working hours, they've got restricted covenants, all these things that kind of tie you to a particular place. But going forward, and in fact, actually, Desmond, this is one of the topics we're going to talk about. Going forward, I think we're going to have to be thinking about a more fluid global workforce that will work in different places, like digital nomads, and how we'll have to reconfigure and revolutionize the employment contract to deal with that. And it's not that easy because the laws in various countries are quite fixed on things like taxation and immigration and social security and when employment rights kick in. So whilst the world is changing in terms of how we wish to operate in the workplace, then the laws haven't yet taken shape with it. So I think I think there's a lot of work to be done to envisage this future place of work, and the law is going to have to shift with it to make it work. That's my
Catherine,
toughest work.
Your point about contracts is really interesting, because I think that employers are starting to realise in Australia that they often had a clause in there that talked about a place of work. Some of them were fortunate enough to say we can direct you to work in other places from time to time. No one really paid attention to that clause very much unless they were relocating, offices. But suddenly now that clause has become quite central in when employers are looking forward to think, well, what is our workplace going to look like? Maybe we're going to have a part work from home, even in some cases wholly work from home, and employees are saying, well, actually I accepted the job on the basis this was an office-based working. I don't wish to work from home. What about expenses? What about other stuff like that? So it's starting to reconfigure the employment relationship to suit, not necessarily tied to office-based working. And I know some of my clients are developing new contracts which are not sort of displaced workers. They're not attached to any particular office, but then they're having to engage with issues like, well, are we going to need them to come in for certain things, for training or things that just can't be done online? What sort of obligations do we need to build into our contracts to ensure that we can actually direct people to do that if we engage them on a wholly remote basis? So they're interesting, I think, issues that employers sort of have to face into when they're looking at how their workplace is going to be reconfigured.
Yeah, and just,
Thanks,
sorry,
Heidi.
just one other quick point. I just think there's some great positives to come out of this. I know it's quite difficult to see the positives of COVID-19, but because we've been forced to think about the way we work differently, then we are going to have to embrace flexible, agile, home, part-time working more. And I think as we do that, that should allow more women to return to the workplace. And I'm speaking from a Hong Kong perspective, where there's quite often a decision made, and not just Hong Kong, across the world, as to whether you're going to be full throttle working or a mother. And in Hong Kong, part-time working hasn't really been considered as a serious option. But I think now that we are being more agile, we are working from home on all these things, I'm hoping that this new, more sympathetic way of working will allow more participation of women in the workplace.
Thanks, Catherine. Let me just follow up with a point that both you and Heidi had referred to in terms of the office, the ability, the traditional idea of the office-based premises, people going in on fixed hours. But as we move along in this this term that everybody has kind of gotten sick of, the new normal, as we move along in terms of what the future office is going to be, what are the kind of issues that we need to deal with if I, as the employee, ask you, my employer, that I really want to work from home, and this is my home office because I can do it. I'm as productive. I can actually deal with whatever you need me to. I can go on Zoom meetings. Is there something in your jurisdiction that would the laws encourage this, discourage this, or completely ambivalent to this? Gagan, if I can get your perspective.
So I think I heard the views of Catherine and Heidi on on flexible employment contracts and giving comfort to the employees from work to home. But in India, large MNCs can still afford to have this kind of a vision for a longer term to have employees. But what we see as a trend is that there is quite frustration with the medium and small scale companies, as well as in startups, wherein they are at the stage of drafting contracts and building up businesses. So I think in India, we do not see something which is in the longer term working from home as a new normal. Regarding what all companies can do for for work from home arrangements, Indian corporates are actually looking at having different kind of creative ideas, more concerned with the drawing personal life and work from home life, fixing hours, giving breaks, stretch breaks. So there are so many creative ideas which companies are actually creating for the employees to have a co-share work arrangement. So India is still evolving with this. There is no law back up this. The only law which back up is the principle of duty to take care from a contractual relationship of a principal and an agent. as an employee. Desmond.
June, can I get you to comment on this as well?
Well, quite interestingly, in the Philippines, 2 years ago, the government has actually started encouraging a work from home setup, but for an entirely different reason. It's due to the traffic jams in Metro Manila. And they wanted to reduce the amount of people on the streets at any given time. And they came up with a telecommuting act. The policies and the arrangements for a work from home arrangement are entirely left to the discretion of the parties by agreement. And some of the interesting questions I think that would come up in the near future for a work from home arrangement in the Philippines would be how to deal with the non-diminution principle and how to eliminate or reduce benefits that are clearly not intended in a work from home setup. For example, transportation allowances. In the Philippines, once you grant that by practice or by contract, you can no longer reduce it. And there would be situations where it would be part of the contract of the employee. So the question is what to do with those transportation allowances when the employees are no longer reporting to the work site. There's also an interesting question of what to do with employees who are unable to report to or unable to work from home for various reasons. You mentioned employees wanting to work from home, but I had a client that asked me, what can I do with an employee who cannot work from home? He insists on reporting to the office. Now, in the Philippines, the grounds for termination are very limited. And if the ground is not among those provided by law, then you can be accused of illegal dismissal. And unfortunately, that specific question is not yet addressed. There are laws that address physical or mental disabilities that prevent employees from working, but there is no law or regulation that would address a technological disability on the part of employees.
Thanks, Jude. Again, looking at the questions, and I guess I'll deal with it on a larger perspective. Isadora, can I get you to pull up poll question 4? I did talk about our panelists' bench experience, and I certainly think that looking at the questions, this is something that maybe we want to quickly address. And really, it's to get a perspective of the biggest challenge that you foresee as you deal with your clients, as you've been advising many of your clients throughout this entire pandemic. What is the biggest challenge that you foresee in managing long-term work from home arrangement? And this would then feed into one of the questions that our audience have asked in terms of how we've seen many of our clients do these sort of arrangements and what are the legal issues involved. So if I can give you another 5 seconds, please pick the question, pick the answer that most fits your perspective, and we can have the discussion from there. Another 3 seconds. And we're good. Isadora, if I can get you to. Now, 40% of all our attendees have said that it's all of the above, really ensuring proper well-being, ensuring optimum use. And this, if I can actually go back to our panelists now, again, Catherine, if I can get you to start off, from your perspective, what is the biggest challenge? And when you are actually looking firstly from an office space perspective, are there any things from Hong Kong law parameters that clients need to really deal with at this point in time as they deal with these kind of alternative work arrangements?
In terms of office space particularly, no, there's no laws in place in relation to office space and COVID. There is the ability to have people working from home, other than the strict rules around law firms, but that's a very specific category. You've got to have bricks and mortar if you're a law firm, and a front door, and safety of your post getting to you. But otherwise, employers are left to their own devices as to how they organize their workspace. So I don't think there's going to be any laws that will prevent these companies from being revolutionary with the way they design their space. I think it will be about trying to ensure that there is still a heart of the company, and that people do come together, and then thinking about how you arrange a space in an interesting way, in an engaging way, and that when people do come together in the office space, what you're going to do with them? You're going to probably focus them more on training and collaboration and all those kind of key water cooler creative moments. So I think possibly the focus on the office space, bricks and mortar, is not really, shouldn't really be the focus. It's how we bring people together well. Are there any laws protecting or preventing us from doing that? And can we use this opportunity to create a new way of working and a new office arrangement? So yeah, that's my thoughts on the office space, particularly as you asked me to look at that one.
Heidi?
Look, from my part, I just wanted to flag, I think the biggest challenge for Australia is that fundamentally we still have a modern award system. So a set of minimum industrial instruments that provide minimum entitlements cover quite a few employees. It's still predicated on a system that's structured around a span of ordinary hours of work and the payment of penalties and overtime outside of that. And that is fundamentally inconsistent with the concept of the flexibility that comes and is coming from working from home. And you've got statutory record keeping obligations to maintain records of overtime hours and when they started and finished the overtime hours. And that is a major headache for a lot of employers. And I think the biggest challenge for employers that are looking to move to more flexible workplace environments is facing into how are you going to grapple with complying with that obligation, as well as meeting the expectations of flexibility for your workforce.
Thanks a lot, Heidi.
Sorry, I should
June,
just flag one more thing. Yeah. Underpayments are a major issue in Australia, a big cottage industry. We've got parliamentary inquiries. So that's going to be, I think, part and parcel of this challenge.
Thanks a lot, Heidi. June, over to you.
I think, yeah, for the Philippines, I think one big challenge would be coming up with proper ways to perform assessments and evaluations of employees, and trying to anticipate and imagine all the conduct that should be prohibited in respect of employees or would be subject to disciplinary action. As I said, in the Philippines, the laws against dismissals are very strict, and therefore companies should be able to anticipate what these types of conduct that they want to control or prohibit in the work from home arrangement are, and they should be able to come up with very specific policies that would give notice to the employees that these types of conduct would result in disciplinary sanction.
Okay. And Gagan, if I can invite you to give a few words.
Desmond, in India, the biggest challenge I think would be for drafting, the explicit work from home policies, because this is an ever evolving and a very first kind of situation this generation has seen, with no precedents whatsoever. And it might, sometimes you draft work from home policies and it lies for 3 years and then you review it. I think this will be, since it will be very evolving, and this might become a contractual obligation when you impose a policy on the employees. You have to be very explicit with your expectations on what you want from employees. It need not be unreasonable, but it should not be very casual approach as well. I think lawyers would need to have a sense of what is going to happen. We have to have a gut feeling to draft these kind of policies so that the employees should not face challenges, at least for coming years, if they're looking for a longer term perspective on this approach. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Gagan. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, too short a time for too long a topic, too many different perspectives. Happy to receive a lot more questions, and we will certainly be able to then direct it to the various panelists or to various experts within our network to be able to guide you along. On that note, I'm going to pass you back to Isadora to do some closing administrative words. Last but not least, I'd like to thank all our panelists for today's session and hope that you enjoyed the session as much as we did. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Desmond. We have now reached the end of the session, but the Legal HR Summit is not over yet, as we have many other sessions coming up today. On your screens, you can see the title of the next session. Finally, I would like to thank everyone for attending this session, and thanks also to all our panelists for their important insights. So with that, the session will now be ending, and I hope to see you on the next one.